Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of ancient warfare distraction from your current world, if you need it, or just if you want it. Anyway, you can, of course, ask a question. That's what I do here. I attempt to answer the questions asked by viewers and Patreon supporters. You can back us on Patreon, of course. Go to patreon.com/ancient warfare podcast. You can back us at one of three levels. And whether you're a Patreon or not, or just a follower or a listener or a random algorithm person who's been hit and going, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to know, ask us a question in the comments, in an email, Telegram, in the street, however you like. My beard is obviously very obvious at the moment. I might shave it at some point and you'll be like, oh my gosh, how am I going to recognize you? Anyway, no, today's question is from Manos. I hope I said that correctly, who asks, having heard and read so much about Phillip and Alexander's training of the Macedonian phalanx to becoming a flexible maneuvering, becoming flexible in maneuvering difficult battle landscapes, as well as proficient when encountering lateral attacks, I remain skeptical about the devastating results in both Cynoscephalae and Pydna, the battles of Cynoscephalae and Pydna. Was it hubris on the part of Philip and later his son Perseus, or lax training which resulted in both battles' outcomes? Okay, one of my favorite topics ever to talk about this, so I'm very happy that you've asked this, Manos. Firstly, of course, the Battle of Cynoscephalae. I had a Roman history lecturer back in the early 90s who said that if we spelt Cynoscephalae correctly, we would always get a bonus mark in an exam. And so all of us who were his students put the word Cynoscephalae into any answer we ever gave him, even if it was not even remotely related to that question. Cynoscephalae for an extra mark. Cynoscephalae fought in 197 BC between Titus Quinctius Flamininus against Philip V of Macedon. Of course, at Cynoscephalae, what you've got is a phalanx of 16,000 men. Interesting, we'll get to that, why that's important. And against around about the same number of infantry in the Roman side. So the Romans have about 25,000 men. The Macedonians have about 25,500. So very, very evenly matched. But there are 8,000 members of the phalanx killed and 5,000 captured. So it's a devastating loss to Philip V. It's not the end of Macedonian resistance in Achaia or Greece, because that comes at the Battle of Pydna, fought in 168 BC, which is against Philip V's son, Perseus of Macedon, against Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Publius Cornelius Scipio Nausicaa. And there you've got the Romans have 38,000 men, the Macedonians 43,000 men, but 20,000 of the Macedonians are killed, whereas according to the sources, 100 of the Romans are killed. We can deal with the incredibly disparate accounts of casualties later. But indeed, these two are devastating losses to Macedonian prestige and manpower, and they are the death knells of the Macedonian phalanx. The phalanx continues on in the east. You have Mithridates with the phalanx still in the 1st century BC fighting Lucullus, but the fascinating thing about it is it's very much the death knell of the Macedonian phalanx. Now, going back in time, however, those 2nd century BC Macedonian phalanxes have only fought other Macedonian-styled Hellenistic phalanxes for the last 130 years. So what you find then is that when Alexander dies in 323 BC and the empire is split between the successors, the Diadochoi, they all take on the mantle of being the next Alexander. And so in several ways, the style of leadership remains the same, that the commander, the king, will lead cavalry in person. That's the Alexander style, and that's what we find in a lot of those generals who succeed. And at the same time, you find that they will also employ the phalanx of Macedonians, 6 taxis made up of 1,500 men each, further divided into 6 smaller subsections of the syntagmata. So for a long time, you get the phalanx is set at around 9,000 men. Over time, though, it starts to get bigger. There's essentially an arms race, a Macedonian Hellenistic style warfare arms race. And on the one hand, it's more elephants, scythed chariots, greater numbers of cavalry. None of those are particularly effective in regard to being the decisive decider on the battlefield. And the other arms race that happens in the successor states is to increase the size of the phalanx. And in the Tactica manuals that we have surviving, it's 16,000. And interestingly, that, of course, is the size of the phalanx at the Battle of is it Pydna or Cynoscephalae? I forget. You've got 16,000 phalangites at the Battle of Cynoscephalae. So interestingly, that sort of development seems to be reflected in those surviving documents, which, of course, only survived from the Roman period. Now, because of that arms race, and because the successor states less look outwards, they don't look to conquer more territory necessarily. They look at reconquering Alexander's territory. So they basically fight one another. And so what happens, I think, is a stagnation of innovation in Hellenistic phalanx tactics, that rather than being a dynamic, flexible, maneuverable formation of infantry that can turn and twist, and again, the Tactica manuals give us all the permutations of orders to make them countermarch and turn to a certain facing and be like an accordion on the battlefield. I think that ceases to be the case because they're fighting other phalanxes. And they were never intended to fight another phalanx. They were intended to fight hoplite formations and then the Persian formations when they invade Persia. And so I think that because they are front to front front to front phalangite battles, Ipsus and all these other battles later, Raphia and things like that, I think they basically stagnate, and they also become less the focus. When you look at Alexander, the 6 commanders of his phalanx are an incredibly stable and incredibly honored group of commanders. In all of his battles for a decade, there's only 16 men who command the phalanx. Some get promoted to the companion cavalry, some die, but it's a very stable, small number of commanders. And I think in the Hellenistic period, we very, very rarely get those commanders named, whereas in Alexander's battles, we're always given the names of the commanders of the taxace of the phalanx. So I think there's a loss of prestige in that, and that therefore means that their status and their not training. I don't think it's training. I don't think they lack the training, but they're not used and they're not utilized in the way that Alexander would have used and utilized them. And so I think there is a stagnation, and there's a stagnation in thinking and in tactics, so that when the Romans encounter the Macedonian phalanx at these battles, it's the latter formation that they've encountering. They're not encountering it at the height of its powers. They're encountering it at the lowest ebb of its development, if you like, where it is a frontal attack anvil, and it's not particularly maneuverable, and it's not particularly flexible. And at the Cynoscephalae, it's attacked by the Romans before it's fully drawn up, and this is a disaster. There's also talk, of course, that the Romans attack it, and the Macedonians, as a sign that they are surrendering, raise their sarissai, and the Romans don't recognize that as a particularly interesting. Well, they don't recognize its symbolism, and so they kill them. Hence the casualties. And at Pydna, they're fighting on bad terrain, and that disrupts their formation. Whereas, as you point out in your question, earlier Alexander would have taken steps to ensure that not only did he take men who could fight in broken terrain, but he would have also taken combinations of light troops to basically mitigate that issue. And so I think that the biggest issue is that the phalanx that the Romans face is not the phalanx of Alexander. It's stagnated since that time, and nor are the Romans facing Alexander. I think Alexander as a commander would have done remarkable things if he'd been in that situation. So I hope, Manos, that answers your question sufficiently. I don't believe that it's hubris on the part of Philip. I think well, actually, it may have been partially hubris in the sense that those commanders thought they were the successors of Alexander, that they thought they were like Alexander. And that's certainly how they present themselves in terms of Hellenistic kingship, but they weren't. So you could say, yes, it was hubris, but not in the sense of the men they've got, but some stagnation in terms of how it was used. I hope that answers your question. And you can join us again for the next episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks very much. See you then.